we start with just an introduction and where you farm so that people have that context, and then we can move on to some of the more panel questions.
I'm Colleen Rentsch, and I'm a fourth generation farmer over in Lake County. My family started farming in the Santa Clara Valley back in, well, forever ago. And my daughter is staged to come up behind me. We hope.
Is she here?
No.
I'm Kyle Farmer. I'm a first generation farmer with fifth generation farming problems. Married my wife as a fifth generation farmer. We raise cattle, sheep, and pigs. Our home place in Potter Valley. Also Redwood Valley, Willits Grade, Navarro Ridge on the coast. We have some leases. And yeah.
That's what preparedness looks like.
The only reason I'm not sitting next to him because I don't want to be blinded by the projector. Nothing personal. My name is Bartholomew. We moved to this property in 1962, so I've been here a little while. The ranch is currently just under 6,000 acres, and I'm in charge of the cattle operation, and then maintenance, and then the local fire chief.
Great, thank you. So one of our questions today is what were some of the unforeseen challenges that you have encountered? And I think thinking of this as what was your encounter with disaster, and what did, kind of the context of what did you have to deal with, so that the audience knows as we progress to the further questions. And we don't have to go in order every time. Anyone that would like to jump in first can go ahead.
I've actually never been involved in cattle ranching at a time which was not a disaster. It is, I moved here 7 years ago, and it's either been a worst drought in California history, largest wildfire in California history, sort of water rights questions and chaos. It's just been a constant disaster the whole time. So I don't know if what it would be like in this sort of imaginary, heavenly world where we weren't a disaster. But I also think that one of the reasons why I perceive anything as a disaster is because I have this expectations of some sort of constancy and predictability. That if that's the way I wanted to live, I probably should have chosen a different profession, right? And I think that anybody within the profession that they choose discovers that within that context it's not predictable or ordered the way we kind of think other people's life, But once you're on the inside, you find out that it's a constant adaptation and responding to chaos. So I think that the times that I've been involved have been a little more chaotic than in the past, and maybe one of the years of my life will be this peaceful situation. But I think that therefore there's a sort of a different response to disaster, which is why this word resilience has become sort of popularized in our conversations, because it acknowledges that prevention, for example, is part of it, which I think we can get confused sometimes and get too focused on this resilience concept, right? But resilience is the complete acceptance that it's going to happen, right? And it's also a realization that choosing vulnerability is better than insisting on prevention, right? So I could disc the whole ranch and get rid of all the grass, and I wouldn't have to deal with fire anymore. In Agricolas, one of the Greek authors writes, they created a desert and called it peace. I think what we're doing is trying to sort of accept a level of risk and accept that for example, fire or flood are going to happen, and then kind of, I'm sort of constantly imagining what if that happened today. I mean, and there's a sort of a probabilistic aspect to that. It's probably not going to happen in the middle of winter. So I can choose on a day in the winter to wear a polyester fabric, for example, but I don't wear polyester fabrics any day in the summer, because if that's the day that the wildfire starts, and I go out there and try to bat it down and my clothes melt to my skin, I'm gonna have regretted that choice. So there's sort of like a constant, there's a, I call it DEB, just do everything better. I think we can get so focused on some of these questions of climate change and disaster resilience or whatever it is. A lot of it is just a constant attempt to elevate our daily practices. Whether it's making sure that our chainsaw fires up the morning of the fire, that it's sharp, to get that tree out of the road. We, on our ranch, tend to operate in what risk management calls running to failure. So basically, like, I'll replace my ATV tires when they're flat, right? And with the thin margins that we all work with, that's often the only way to go about things. But I've tried to now, during fire season at least, go towards a model of sort of replacing things before it's that day, because we managed to make it through these 2 wildfires that we've experienced. I had just the thinnest, I had these sort of street racing ATV tires, and I was driving over coals. And I think about that all the time when I'm looking at my tread on my ATV tires. Like, if this is the day that the fire starts, what do I want my tread to look like? If this is the day the fire starts, you know, do I want to have to do an oil change before I go out there? So and the good thing is all of the things that I could be doing to try to do a better job with wildfire are also the things that are going to make my whole business run more smoothly. So that sometimes these sort of disaster mentalities can help us do a better job regardless. I think the power outages are another great example, where if the power outages are an emergency for me, I know that there's going to be, every time that there's a fire, there's also going to be a power outage. So the more I can build everything in, whether it's using more solar or installing a transfer switch so that we can run our pump off of a generator, whatever it is, that when the power outage happens, if it's kind of like no big deal, that means when the fire and the power outage happens, I can focus on the fire and not focus on the power outage. So, I don't know, I'm rambling, but.
Colleen, I'm gonna have you switch mics for a second.
Okay. Well, I wasn't quite sure on the format, and I'm telling my story. So bear with me. So fire, flood, power outages, market corrections, our farm's seen it all. The last 18 months have been particularly challenging. But first, a reminder to all of us, and my mantra now, we are farmers, we are resilient, we are problem solvers, and we think out of the box, and next year is always going to be better. So that's the attitude, because that's survival mentality if we want to keep doing what we're doing. So the fire came right down to the edge of our farm. Cal Fire saved my dad's house. We knew it was coming, so we had a few days, so we parked every piece of equipment, tractors, everything, out in the middle of the 30-acre walnut orchard. And we had been irrigating, so the ground was pre-irrigated, the leaves were lush, nothing was gonna burn out there. We lost power, so there were no irrigations, so for my row crops, that was the biggest fear, that I didn't think the fire was gonna come down into the middle of my disc field, but I was gonna have water issues, and I had an acre of watermelons out there. We were allowed to get back in with a farmer's fast pass about a week before everybody else in town was able to come back, and PG&E was there when we got there. So we got power back up and pumps turned on, so we averted that. While the power was out, the neighbors' cows, they didn't have water, and we didn't think about it because they're the neighbors' cows, but my brother realized, and so he started pumping water out of my dad's swimming pool, taking it down there in troughs, and they were emptying those troughs faster than he can keep them filled. By the time the water, or the fire came down to the valley floor, Cal Fire opened the gates and let them out into the orchards, and they were relieved and happy because there was water, shelter, apples in the orchard, and they were breaking off all the sprinkler heads. But that, I don't mind. I'm willing to be a good neighbor and do that. the pears and the watermelons were ready while we were evacuated, so we didn't have crew to get back in. So by the time we were allowed back in, the sunshine watermelons were overripe. So that's when I became those cows' very best friend, because they were getting launched over the fence and cows learned that, oh my God, we love watermelon. And I have pictures of yellow and red watermelons splatted all out there, it looked like sherbet. And then the cows, I have videos to music where they're running across the field and mooing at me, and it just, I love those cows. They now eat out of my hand. With zero habitat left up in the forest, all the wildlife moved down into the valley floor. So we were already having problems with feral pigs, so we had built brand new pig fencing around the entire property. So CAL FIRE bulldozed 2 holes through the fence. The pigs were back in. We had a bear crawling over another section of the fence, and the Gala apples were just getting ripe, and they're nice and red, and the birds pecked a hole in every single apple on that first variety. So I lost that. The pigs were hanging out the peaches, and I had abandoned the peach orchard, but the ground was wet, there were peaches on the ground, and the trees were laying down on the ground because we hadn't pruned them in 3 years. So there was cover, so they were hiding in there. So you didn't ever want to really be walking around because they were mean. So they moved from the peach orchard into the watermelons. And we showed up one morning with about 6 pigs out in the watermelons. My nephew jumps on the quad, runs out there to shoo them away. And they just stood there and looked at it. He's up there bumping them with the quad, and they're like, yeah, we're not leaving. And this is like day 8, I guess, of the fire, and everything had been, I was handling it all well. I lost my shit. I called Caroline, I was so upset, and she had said that try putting floodlights and a radio out there on talk radio. Because somebody in Redwood Valley had done that the year before, and it worked. And it did, it worked. So we were laughing about what talk radio? So I was like, Rush Limbaugh. So I left that on for 3 weeks, and they laughed that he didn't come back. We were able to get harvesting, but then the food hub truck couldn't get to us over the Lake County line. So I lost about 2 more cycles of sales on that. So that's my farming, my row crops. As far as the family farm goes, we own 80 acres of wine grapes. And our vineyard sat in the soup for 2 weeks. And so the winery refused to take our crop due to smoke taint, which does not taste like barbecue, it tastes like licking an ashtray. So they are unsellable. So that's 3/4 of our farm's income. Luckily, we had some farming for crop insurance. Some neighbors did not. And then this year, the government WIP program kicked some more money down. So it didn't make us whole, but we did suffer a loss on that. So the fire for us is over. It's 6 months later, and now it's in a flood. And I was worried about how there was no habitat or no trees up in the forest to hold all that water back. So we did take out some flood insurance. We live right on levees, and I was concerned that the levees might break because I just was envisioning this flood coming down. So that didn't happen, but I got some water in the fruit stand, and my brother calls, and it was Valentine's Day last year. My brother's like, yeah, they got some water up in the fruit stand. Well, how's it look, Ben? Yeah, I think you're all right. And that spidey sense was like, get in the car and go look. And I drove up, and I'm like, oh, shit. So luckily this time I only about 10 inches in there, but I had 6 tons of butternut squash in there too. And that's not food safety compliant. So I had run out of plastic bins, so I put them in wood bins, and that meant I put a liner in. That liner saved my because I would have lost everything. The water came up right to the bottom of the bin. It didn't get in the bin. I'm getting scattered. So we were pushing the bins out in the water. I was floating them out, and the forklift is picking them up, and so that disaster was averted. But I did wind up having to dump about a ton of them because I had to move them into the barn and all the humidity, and they just didn't hold very well. So I had a loss on that. So then the fire's over, and 6 months later, it's fire season again. And PG&E wants us just gonna turn off all the power. You're like, well, shoot, I have all my pears and apples in 2 coolers. We can't afford generators to power the amount of energy that it takes to run those units. So I just turned the thermostat down to 32, kept the door shut. I wasn't selling to anybody that week. So I lost 2 weeks of sales. And I also sell to schools, so they close the schools, I don't have sales. So that was a financial impact also. I did wind up having to dump about a bin and a half or a ton and a half of pears, because pears only hold so long in the cooler, and with those lost sales, they were getting too ripe in the cooler again at the end of the season. So I'm gonna pass this on. I have more, but I'm not gonna take up the whole time. I'll come back later to that.
When we didn't have the wind here that they had in Ridgewood Valley and Potter Valley, and so the fire behavior wasn't as extreme as it was in Ridgewood Valley and Potter Valley, and it happened. It wasn't by planning; it was by chance. All the cows happened to be up here in this paddock that was not affected by the fire, and so as far as the livestock, we didn't have any issues. We had to replace or rebuild 9 miles of fencing, but we were able to do that with the help of the NRCS. In fact, Katie Delbar came here to the ranch and signed us up, and they were very helpful and to get us through this. I think the things we need to think about more, like, the obvious things, generators, drinking water, we all have that, we all think about that. Some of the issues we had that we didn't think about was, and both of these folks talked about, is your infrastructure. Make sure your infrastructure is resilient to fire. So, your water system. We have a domestic water system, and a lot of the PVC pipes were above ground, and so they were affected. However, we had enough that didn't burn, that kept us through. So take a real hard look at all your infrastructure and make sure that it is fire resistant or fireproof. The time you spend now doing that will pay off when you do have a fire. And one other thing that I never thought about was culverts. We had a whole bunch of plastic culverts, and somebody was going up through the fire area. It had been a week, and they said, your plastic culverts are gone. And so pay attention to those things that you don't think about. Until I never thought about a plastic culvert. A culvert can't burn. Well, 9 of them did, and we weren't, because we wanted to get them replaced before the winter. We didn't get any cost share money to help with that. We just did it. And the other big issue we had was communication. And so at 2 in the morning, I received a cell phone call, and the fire was about a mile into the property already. Our property is 3 miles along the highway here, and up on top are the towers for the cell phones, for the telephones, for the sheriff, and for CAL FIRE. And probably an hour later, I don't know when the phones quit, but the phones quit, and so we had no communication, which I didn't think about it, but my 2 children who live in Texas and San Diego were thinking about it because they didn't hear from us for 72 hours. And so I would make sure you have some way to communicate with your family, people that are worried about you. Figure that out ahead of time. If my cell phone doesn't work, what am I going to do? Let me cast my thought here. And so I think just take a really good hard look at your infrastructure, and we're all busy. We're all like, you know what? I'm going to do this trimming. You know, CAL FIRE's not going to come inspect till June. You know, I'm going to wait till May to do my trimming. Guess what? We never do it, do we? So maybe take a little time, starting right now, every week. I don't care how busy you are, and start preparing yourself for this coming fire season. Because I worked for CAL FIRE for 23 fire seasons in this county. 2017 was the worst fire I ever saw in this county. It was always happening somewhere else. Well, it happened here, and it's going to happen again. So we need to be prepared, and along with being prepared is helping each other.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, ever to all of you. I think, you know, so at this point, I think, you know, people hear these stories, and I'm sure, you know, many people have experiences like these yourselves, and you have these experiences. I'm wondering if we can move on to, there's a couple more questions I'd like to address, and one is eventually what are tools or things that you're doing differently now, which I think you started to talk about a little bit, Brian, but I think before we do that, you know, lessons or tools that you learned in that moment to deal with those extreme circumstances, maybe we could start there.
Yeah, I was compiling a list, sort of like an Oscar acceptance speech of people I need to thank, because that's really what it comes down to, I think. And it's interesting to think about at what scale we need to have the communities to deal with these things, because at a certain, you know, Brian and I would be great people to help each other in the middle of a fire, except for if we're both dealing with our own emergencies. So we need enough of a scaled community to be able to travel to each other. I mean, if you think about it, we send firefighters to Australia and they send firefighters here. I think that at some point we're going to start doing that for prescribed burns, so we can hit the windows when they happen. So I'd like to thank Bach Electric. He came out and installed a transfer switch on my pump. But the funny thing is, I was actually trying to get him through the roadblock. So that's how, sort of, once the fire happens, you're in this situation where you start trying to do crazy things in the middle of the fire that you really need to do beforehand, right? So Devin Jones at the Farm Bureau was able to put together, I don't know what your sort of, what do you call it? Farmer-friendly pass?
My Farmer Fast Pass.
Yeah. So the Farm Bureau just immediately got on this Farmer Fast Pass situation. And I was trying to get the electrician on the Farmer Fast Pass situation because I was spending a significant amount of my time driving around like a crazy person in the truck that I had smashed up the first night responding to the fire as a volunteer firefighter. I had driven through a tree, taken off my rear view mirrors, and broken my windshield. So then I was continuing to drive around in this truck with two 250-gallon totes and trying to keep all the cattle in water because none of the electricity was working for any of the pumps. So I also need to thank Jake Slates, the highway patrolman, who let me through again and again, even before the Farmer Fast Pass had gone together, in order to get water to the cattle. And since then, you know, trying to think about just bigger troughs, you know. If you can get water to a 500-gallon trough, you know, that's the same as getting water twice to a 250-gallon trough. So gravity is your friend is something I'm always thinking about. Is there any way we can make this operate on gravity? You know, during the power outages and during the 18 fire, I just stacked up pallets high enough that I could fill water tanks that were high enough to then transfer to the other water tanks without needing to run some sort of pump to do it. So anytime we can get water up high, then you don't need some sort of pump situation. Aaron Gilliam, Travis Jane, and Marie Hoff came and just took care of our sheep. It was kind of this, it wasn't that the sheep were the emergency, but we needed to trim their hooves and we needed to kill strip them before they were gonna lamb. And so they came up, got through the roadblock, set up a corral, and just took care of the sheep. So it's not just the actual emergency things that you're gonna need help with, it's the things that you're gonna not be doing because you're probably the best person to deal with the emergency because that's gonna require the most sort of out-of-the-box thinking. So if you can have people come in and help with the things that you can't do that you normally do, then you can have the freedom to deal with all the emergencies that are happening. You know, people who are, my family went and stayed with in Ukiah during the power outage. Rose Bell, I need to thank. Rich Bazil, the vet, came out and inspected the cattle that we had gathered. Ended up telling me that I had to basically put them all down. The fire had come through so fast that they were burned to the point that they were going to slowly die. Chris Bartow came out on horseback and helped me gather. So I was there on my ATV with my chainsaws and my drone and my dogs, and he was there just stepping over the trees that I had to cut this course. So between the two of us, we were able to make it through one of the ranches that had burned and figure out how many cows were already dead and gather the rest, thinking that we were saving them. And then afterwards, Brian Bartholomew, Adam Gaska, and Terry and Taffy, we all worked together to figure out where we were going to move cattle to that we had lost pasture for, and made some really interesting agreements, more based on topography than property lines, to figure out where to build some of these fences to get places that hadn't been grazed for a long time grazed again. Caltrans and the taxpayers built the fence along the highway. That would have been a huge job and a really kind of technical job to try to do if you didn't have the capacity that Caltrans does to put cones along the road and everything else. Building fences along roads can be really dangerous. So I think it's really great that Caltrans made that commitment and investment. We have a really nice fence along the road there now. And then similarly, I mean, not as like your refrigeration challenges for us were the refrigeration challenges of our meat processors. And they had to do the same thing because it would cost Redwood Meats up in Eureka that we slaughter through $300,000 worth of generators to keep those things going if they were going to do that. So they closed the doors and wouldn't open them. And then it became this really collaborative challenge to try to move the meat. You know, beef can hang for a while, pork can't. So it was really the pork that my wife Grace had to really try to start figuring out how are we going to make sure that all of this collected sunlight doesn't go bad. And Fallon Hills, what was his name? I was going to write it down. Kevin from Fallon Hills borrowed a truck from Golden Gate Meat Company, drove all the way up at like 2 in the morning and managed to get our pigs delivered to different places and keep the food moving so it wouldn't rot. So it really, I mean, it was just a huge collaborative effort. And then in the 18 fires, we had 4,000 acre ranch burn, but we didn't have any cattle on it at the time. It was part of sort of a deferred rotation we do. So in that case, I was available to try to help other people. You know, the power outage was going on, but we had developed systems that made power outage not be such a big deal in terms of managing water flow, and you know, all it was.
Put it by your mouth.
Oh,
right?
yeah. There.
Keep it there.
Okay.
It's a wife thing.
So just down to electric fence chargers, you know, getting electric fence chargers that can be plug-in chargers that all you do is switch them over to a battery, rather than having to pull your fence chargers off and putting completely different ones on. So that fire wasn't as much of a problem in terms of what we had to do. So I was able to go out in the National Forest with the whole convoy of cattle trailers. The ranchers who had cattle out in the National Forest, it was just an amazing day. They actually cut brush and created corrals out of brush, and we were able to load cattle out of the middle of the pastures with cut brush corrals into this whole series of cattle trailers and got out of Horse Mountain as the fire was coming. But that was once again, 8 cattle trailers getting together, highway patrol allowing us through, trusting us to not create an emergency for everybody that didn't have to try to save us, and we were able to bring quite a few cattle out of that situation, which, like Brian says, was a much different fire. The fire where we lost 45 head in Redwood Valley, was moving a football field every 3 seconds. If we had gotten there earlier, we would have died too. So it's really that's where the resilience comes in. There's certain things you can't try to harden yourself against. It's about accepting that's going to happen and then dealing with it afterwards.
Kyle, maybe before we move on, I think you spoke really well about the network that supported you, but I'm wondering, in that moment when you are dealing with, you have trees down and you're trying to get water to animals and your sheep need taken care of, how did those connections happen? Do you have the network to call? Were people calling you? And is there anything that you would recommend or have done differently in terms of reaching out to that web?
I think I would have thought earlier about that I didn't only need help in the actual disaster. That point where people were calling me, what can I do? What can we do to help? And I actually didn't need people to go into the mountains with me because there's very few people with that sort of skill set that I needed, and that would be I think we need to have really strong networks of people who know how to gather animals and have access to some fire gear, and that needs to be more sort of an official network that we have, because we have sort of volunteer networks for animal rescue in terms of dogs and cats and horses, but in terms of getting an entire semi-truckload of cattle out of a certain area, there's probably only a couple dozen people in the county who would be appropriate to send into that situation. So I wish I would have thought more about who could be teaching people how our water trough system works. Because then I could have said, hey, yeah, I can use your help. Can you just keep these water troughs full? So the kind of secondary helping is actually could be more important than just the disaster helping. I wish I had thought about that more. A big thing was that Grace evacuated and was in Ukiah and could be doing those connections, kind of like in the movies where there's like the person who sits in the painter van, with the computer. But we were meeting at the checkpoint. I brought some really important toys to my kids, the Whizzy Dizzy. I don't know if you guys have kids. But we met at the checkpoint where we would transfer some things out, bring some things back in. AT&T cell network was working while Verizon wasn't, and so we got a temporary, cheap AT&T cell phone, so that I was able to get cell access again. Funny enough, Grace, I'm going to throw Grace's mom under the bus. She evacuated with all of the flashlights, at least from their house. But then batteries, you have enough batteries, so that, and all those things were just us when we were, I was calling the few people within my network, I'm making a cross checkpoint transfer. Is there anything that you guys need too? But with the cell networks down, those are all things that we could make much smoother. And I think also, that choice, are you going to evacuate or not, as a rancher, or as a farmer, is a big deal. I don't know. I don't want to tell anybody to break any laws or anything, but there are souls reliant on you when you're the one making their artificial water source available to them. So, but the big thing I've been thinking about is that just like if you are going to evacuate, there's a lot of houses that burn down a long time afterwards. Right? The fire moves through, the house doesn't light on fire, and it's that little kind of pile of leaves in the gutters or underneath the eaves that eventually catches and grows and takes the house out. Even if you don't plan on evacuating, you still can't be protecting your house. Like, your house needs to be able to stand by itself, and your house needs to be a place that firefighters could retreat to and be safe and let the fire go over them. It shouldn't be your house should be an asset to the firefighters and to yourself if you're going to stay, rather than a liability. So one thing I did was since the fire, is I came in and I just wrecked the landscaping around my house. And I'm still there's a great book called Firescaping, and I'm gonna, as I replant and try to make it pretty again, it'll be a place that you can just leave in a second and not think about it. And that's something that I'm gonna have to be doing in the winter, not in the middle of fire season, is keeping it ready for that so that it's not a liability. I'm sure everybody here knows Bill and Jay. I was up at their place, and I feel like there's no stronger mark of an accomplished gardener than a wisteria branch going over an arbor, right? Isn't that you did it, it's not something you can just create in an afternoon. It's not like a bunch of little annual flowers you bought at Home Depot and just stuffed around, that's commitment. And they cut that thing off, and I just was looking at that wisteria stump. It was like, they get it. That's the game changer when you start thinking about fire. Is as beautiful as that was, they're going to rethink the aesthetics of their garden to be the California landscaping around their house. And I'm sure that was a hard thing to do with that pruning saw, But that's kind of what I did with my skid steer when I yanked the plum tree out from near my house, just rethinking what the aesthetics of the garden are. Firescaping, you guys went to that talk the other day. It's a great book to get started.
So kind of to that point as well, CAL FIRE took a stand at my dad's house because they had mowed, they take the mower every spring and just mow around the entire hillside. He lives on a hill right where the fire would just come down, and then it's valley. So that's where they took a stand, and they cut all the trees up, limbed them up to about 10 feet high. So that's where that's what we're gonna do from now on. So that's what we're doing on his hillside, is pulling out the laurel bay trees, full of oils. Don't want those near the house. The buckeyes, they look pretty in the spring, but then they have dead leaves on them all winter. Not gonna have that near the house. So we're logging on the hillside next to my dad's house. As far as the rest, I think the only biggest challenge with the fire was the lack of power. Our extended family always jokes that when the zombie apocalypse happens, that they are all going to make their way to Lake County because we're all going to have our outposts and we have food. we don't have cattle though. We don't have meat, but so that would be the only thing, is to redesign the pumps so that we had power. We have a generator that we can hook in. We can get fuel out of the tanks, but that and paperwork. That's when the fire was headed our direction. I went up, and we have 60 years of farm records in the office. I just went up there and started pulling everything out of the house. My dad's 87. What are you doing? You're overreacting. And then the next day I came back and got the antiques out of the house. He was pissed. Stop it, that's enough. It's never come down this far before. He never said thank you.
Maybe, Colleen, before you pass it on, I think when you tell your story of just, one thing after another, I'm just wondering, in those moments, how did you decide what's step one? What do you do first to manage?
I think I'm more of a reactionary, not proactive. We've had fire just come over the ridge top before, but they'll get it. This was in the olden days. And we saw that this thing's coming. So I just, like I said, I got the files, got furniture out. It wasn't like the Redwood Valley fire. We had plenty of time, moved equipment. I don't really have a new and better action plan for it to happen again tomorrow, other than we need to keep power restored for ourselves. So I'd like to say I learned more lessons other than fires proofing the house, and we're down on the valley and everything's green. So the orchard floor is clean, there's green everywhere. It stopped right at the edge of the walnuts. The leaves weren't even singed. So But my dad's dog had cancer at the time, and the stress of it, he passed away when we were all evacuated. Well, they didn't leave the ranch, but we found a litter of kittens out in the middle of the orchard, so now we have those.
You know, one thing that when you were telling your story at first, Colleen, you mentioned crop insurance, and then also making the choice to do flood insurance at one point. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you make those decisions, and you know, where you're getting that insurance, and any kind of tools or thoughts you could offer on that process.
My dad has always been a proponent of crop insurance, but mostly it's because of frost damage. So losing your buds during frost in the grapes, and then walnuts, Lake County has a really late walnut harvest, so we've walked away from 10 acres of a variety because it was too wet to get equipment out there anymore. So that's why we protect for that. So that's kudos to Dad and his lifetime of farm experience, and we will continue that trend. It's not cheap, but for row crops, I wouldn't do it for myself, but for other operations, you know, for the walnuts and grapes and pears and things, I would. We go through State Farm. There's Allied, there's a lot of companies that do that. You missed the deadline, it was until January 31st. What was your other question?
Yeah, I think that covered it. Yeah. And in terms of, I mean, were there other kind of county services or tools that ended up helping you in any way, Colleen?
Well, the Farm Service Agency, we came over, then we signed up for the WHIP program so reparations. Oh, and then we received money through them for the walnuts this year because China and the trade tariffs, we took a tremendous hit on price last year. A lot of those FSA programs you aren't eligible for unless you have crop insurance, because you have to kind of show them that you care enough about your crops to invest yourself into it before the government's going to give you money to make you whole again. So we got a little bit of money for that, but better than a poke in the eye.
Thank you. Brian, just to bring it back, we're talking about lessons that you learned or tools that helped you or that you feel like would help you in the future as you went through this process.
Well, I think, you know, we've all talked about it, and it's, you know, and I said something about it earlier about hardening up your infrastructure so the cows can get watered without electricity, that things won't, whether the power is out or you have a fire, that your cattle still have water. Because trust me, during these disasters, you have better use of your time than just trying to keep the cattle watered. There's all kinds of other things to do. All the new fence that we put up is steel posts, steel string posts, and steel T-posts. We didn't replace anything with wood. So that's one thing we did different. The other thing I didn't talk about is our biggest financial hit was timber. And so everything on the east side of the highway burned out, which was probably 75% of our timber. And we ended up, there was 75 acres that we had to replant, 22,000 new trees, and that was help with RCD, or NRCS and RCD help, they paid for that planting. The one thing I would suggest, if you have any kind of timberland, it's very important to try to get it harvested the next year after the fire. And so we were fortunate enough, we had friends and business acquaintance that got us right on the track of getting the timber harvested. And we were able to harvest the year after the fire when the price of logs was very good. We got the same price as green timber, and so it worked out fine for us. Those folks that harvested last year, the timber price was way low, it was, I'm not sure, it was like 3,000, and it cost 200, it's about 200 just to harvest it, a board foot. And so they pretty much paid for their harvest. So if you have timber, be very diligent that next year. Start right after the fire, start figuring out how you can harvest that timber the next year. And what other tools? I don't have any that come to mind. I would really like to give a shout out to our local agencies that came to our aid, and I know came to Kyle's also, that they came here to help us, and it was a big deal to get through this.
Brian, maybe you could add to that. You mentioned the RCD and the NRCS and the way that they supported during this disaster and recovery. How did you find those resources? How did you know what they could offer?
How did I find out? I think one of the neighbors called and said, "Hey, you need to get signed up now," and that's how. And then I called the office and she came up. And the two programs that we used were they'll pay for emergency feed, and so because we have 1,800 acres that we graze, we were down to 600, and so all the younger cattle I put in the barn, we fed hay, and then we got money to repair the fence.
Great, thank you.
I think one thing, you already had a good logging road from previously. Would you have been able to do all that if you hadn't already invested in that road?
No. So we have on the property, we have a non-industrial timber harvest plan, which is fancy words for a 100-year sustainable plan that you're growing timber faster than you're harvesting. And so we had already harvested twice. So Kyle's correct. All the roads and the infrastructure to do the logging work was in place. And we had a forester already. And so when you have the emergency, they bypass some of the environmental stuff, so it speeds up. Because they have to check for arc sites on the property. And so all that was done before. And so you're right, that was a big help, and that's probably what enabled us to harvest the next year.
And then did the Goldens harvest out your road too?
Yeah. So our neighbors that harvested this last year had to come through our road, and so he built a new road onto our property, and then they came down off what we call Laughlin Road, which is off the highway here, not the one in Redwood Valley. But we had cooperated quite a bit, with the Goldens, and we went on their property to fix our fence, and then Kyle and Matt, they put some cows down below, a little bit on our property too, which we don't have access to normally, and to really help get some of that grass eaten down for fire safety.
I'd like to add that, as far as resources go, if you aren't a Farm Bureau member, I recommend you become one, because that's your farmer network, and that's where they're the ones disseminating the information out, getting people together that might help you in a situation that you need, and that's where we get most of our information.
On the topics of things you wish you knew, we had 3 dozer lines blasted through the middle of our place, and the 17 fires stopped at the first one, but there's no way it's getting the Highway 20 dozer line for those fires was right in the middle of our place. And just before that had happened, we had been talking about decommissioning one road, and also even possibly narrowing all of the roads. And it's funny, I thought that we actually had the right to make a choice like that. It turns out now we have a place you could land a 747, right? So that actually completely changed my mentality. At first it was like, roads are a huge erosion issue. How can we minimize this? Do we need to be able to get a truck up here? Or, could we allow the angle of repose to kind of reset and just have it be something you have to take a side by side? Now my mentality is, how do I maintain this dozer line in a more sustainable way? How do we keep it from growing back into brush? How do we perhaps burn off the grass that grows each year? And also, how can I get CAL FIRE to acknowledge that there's a dozer line there so they don't send 7 dozers next time? If I can actually have that be a fire break that's permanently taken care of, I've been taking pictures of it. So the next time CAL FIRE shows up, I'm going to be able to show them before they allocate dozers that all you really need is maybe a hand crew to light it off. Because that will, when the Barry says it's a great trial to be patient in an emergency, so I'm still thinking about this as if it's like the day that fire happened, and yet there's still things that are on my list to do that day that I haven't done yet. One of them will be to fully recover those dozer lines, and then maintain them permanently. I'm going to get into goats, and we're going to be grazing that dozer line. So it will stay as a fire break as long as I can keep it that way, and that way hopefully there won't be as much destruction the day of the fire, because it. So also I didn't understand until there was a hunter that came a few years later that we actually had more rights to have that recovered than I thought. That's actually what the guy did for a living. He goes out with an excavator and drags topsoil back up, and tries to put it on the dozer line again. Instead, that's going to be a 1,000-year project, right, to get some of that land back in shape. And I wish I had known, because I did try to push them, but there's a lot. One thing is that in any disaster, there's people who need help even more than you, so you kind of feel guilty asking for help. But I wish I would have pushed CAL FIRE more and maybe had some more assistance in getting that dozer line rehabbed, because it's definitely beyond my capacity. It's probably a few $100,000 project if you're going to hire the people to really put all that back in order. If there are property destruction during a fire, at least it's in the writing that they're supposed to make it whole again. What does that mean when that much earth has been moved? I don't know.
Yeah, part of their job after the fire is making sure everything's whole, and sometimes you have to go out and advocate for yourself. You have to go out and see what's going on and make sure things are happening. Can you still hear me? And then also with the PG&E contractors, we had some of the same issues with them, where they came in right after the fire and cut trees that they'd never cut before, which I understand that, but then they locked them. We're out again. Or I'll just yell really loud.
Should have showered.
Yeah, really should have. And so the PG&E contractors came in and took all these trees and lopped them into 10-foot lengths that we couldn't do anything with, that we're going to end up burning. So after the second or third day, I caught them, and they left the rest in log lengths so we could harvest them. So you have to be out there right after you have a fire, be out on your property and bug those guys, Any contractors that are out there, go talk to them. And any CAL FIRE people, go talk to them and say, what is the rehab plan? And, sometimes you gotta be pretty persuasive, but that's what they have to do. They have to leave your property whole, and whatever that takes. Sometimes they'll you know, in Kyle's case, he wants to keep that fire line. But, you know, get up there right after the fire and make sure that stuff happens on your property.
Thank you. So, you know, I think all of you have addressed this in different ways, but just to pick up any loose ends here, I think our final question is, well, what are you doing differently today to prepare for the future, knowing what you know now?
I gotta think about that.
I was just showing Brian, I'll show anybody our little fire trail we put together, not that it's gonna be what's gonna stop, you know, a downslope wind event fire. But the main thing I'm doing is I'm trying to light the whole place on fire.
I'm not sure if
Hello?
you
The main thing that I'm doing is I really want to try to choose when the fire happens. I don't want it to happen in late October after a drought. I want it to happen this time of year. So that's, as a lot of us know now, I mean, the reason the landscape has been as generous to us as it has been is because it was managed using fire for thousands of years by people that understood how to do it. So we're having to relearn those things. That's the biggest difference, I think, is that the fire return interval that was maybe 10 years is now 40, 50. And we're really having to pay that debt. And it's not something that you can do as an individual landowner. I mean, even at a scale of a relatively large piece of land, you still have to be collaborating with your neighbors. In many cases, to do fires, to light prescribed fires, they're gonna have to be lit from my neighbors' houses, because that's the safest way to do it, is have the fire start at their house and go towards me rather than go towards me and stop at their house. So so you have your fire safe councils. I think that's gonna be the first step, is to sort of coalesce into fire safe councils based on these sort of fire sheds that we understand how fire is going to move well enough to know, you know, what are the exposures, which houses are exposed if a fire lights along the road along my place, which houses are at risk if it sweeps up to my place and gets to them. So we're linked with responsibility through the movements, relatively predictable movements of some of these fires. So I'd like to have, and I'm working with CAL FIRE to try to do it, the hardest prescribed fires with their help. I'm sure we've all been seeing what CAL FIRE has been doing. They're basically doing some of the things that they used to do until the 60s or 70s when they stopped. I mean, we got the teletorch back out, right? When did they really stop?
They were still doing it when I was working in up to the early 90s. Yeah. And then everybody complained about the smoke and kind of shut it down.
And one big thing that's changed is, very recently, is that the air quality districts are actually getting reimbursed by the states for time spent dealing with the excess work that comes from prescribed fire. So they're actually incentivized from a budgetary standpoint to put some attention to this. There's models now that can sort of see, just like we kind of know if it's going to rain a couple days, we can see where the smoke will go that day. But it's going to be a shift in our baseline understanding of what California air should be like. Right now we're imagining that it should be perfectly clean and pure, when actually it should probably be a little bit smoky. So once we can kind of shift that baseline to a more realistic baseline, I think we could, within probably 20 years, be back into a situation where the fires aren't going to burn as intensely. So there's a few key fires that I can imagine having on our place that would not only make the trees on our ranch a lot safer, because there's a huge difference in oak mortality, for example, between the 2017 fire that I'm out in that fire all the time, and those trees are dead, and the 18 fire, which burned less intensely, and those trees are alive. So if we don't do this differently, we're going to have high tree mortality, which is going to alter our water cycle and tip Mediterranean climate to a desert. So I think prescribed fire is going to be the only, on a sort of mass hill scale, is the only way to make this truly resilient. But that all starts with the community involvement, with the hardening the houses, with the fire safe councils collaborating, with, and sometimes grazing these fuel loads down before we light them, and then managing them in perpetuity. I think we often are looking for a solution when it's really just a management question, right? Jeff Stackhouse says it's called land management, not land do it once and walk away. So, and Camus says we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Right? So that's the ultimate question: is we're gonna have to maintain these fuel loads for hopefully 1,000 generations. But right now we're in a pickle because you can't light them on fire because there's just so much fuel in there.
I wanted to bring up another topic that it's not just natural disasters, but there's also market corrections and fluctuations, which can be just as devastating to your farm. There's a huge oversupply of wine grapes right now. So like I said, we grow wine grapes, pears, and walnuts. If your contract has expired with your winery, you're in a tough spot right now because wineries are not renewing contracts due to the oversupply and prices are low. We're finding ourselves in this situation right now, and I said earlier that that's 3/4 of our farm's income is those wine grapes. And then I mentioned the tariffs last year with the walnuts, so prices were down in walnuts. And 18 years ago, we pulled out 100 acres of pears because the pear market was down. Well, it came back a little bit, but now it's cycled down again. So you're going to see another mass exodus of pear trees in Mendocino County. It's already started. We gave up our pear orchard. We've been leasing it all this time, and the family that's been running it, he said the price they got this year is what we were getting in the 80s. So I looked it up. In 1988, minimum wage was $4.25. The cost of all the other inputs, the labor, the harvesting, I think it's the industry that's going to go away. So peaches are the same thing. You have to thin them, prune them. So peaches are coming out like crazy. We diversified. My dad, when my grandpa started, we were only pears. My dad diversified, and all 3 of those crops are getting hit in the shorts right now. So, there's always going to be something. You don't always know what it's going to be, but I just try to keep it in perspective because it's pretty gloomy around our farm right now. And I'm just remembering that my family has farmed through the Great Depression, 2 world wars, oil embargoes, recessions, multiple changes in the markets. During World War II, my grandpa lost his entire pear crop at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean when the ship it was on got bombed. So I think there was some kind of insurance. My dad telling the story, but there was lawyers involved, and I'm not sure if or how much he got paid back for that. But that was 2 generations ago. So we're still here and just trying to hold it together because I have a daughter and her fiance who really want to be the next in line to farm because it's a sickness. And we don't want to go work in somebody's office all day. So that's where I'm just going to say my last point again is that we are farmers, we are resilient, we are problem solvers and out of the box thinkers. And for us, I'm going to just keep saying to myself, next year is going to be better.
Brian, any final thoughts on what you're doing now, knowing what you know to prepare for the future?
Yeah, I think I said before.
Can
That the mic doesn't
you hear
work.
Brian? Yeah. Sorry, you're gonna have to do the lean again.
Oh, either that or yell really loud. I can do either one.
Well, I think I already said, your infrastructure, and so all our fences are now steel. We still have a considerable amount of wood fences. The cattle, the water system will work whether there's electricity or not, or whether there's fire or not. And I think the biggest thing is trying to do these fire prevention. We always put stuff off, we're always busy. We're going to start doing our fire prevention stuff earlier and be a little more prepared. I thought we were prepared, we weren't. We would have had some devastating losses given the winds that they had in the River Valley, Potter Valley. We just were lucky we didn't. I think for just the last thought, a shout out to all our local fire departments. This county is protected by volunteers. Your neighbors, your friends, people in this room. When we had the fire, we had fire engine and water tender from Gualala. They got out of their beds in the middle of the night to come help a neighbor. So I would challenge everybody in this room and tell your friends, whatever they can do to support your local volunteer fire department, be in it a volunteer, go help with a fundraiser, but do something to help them, because they're the ones that come to your house. They're the ones that will save your house and save houses, because CAL FIRE has a lot of resources. They have 17 engines, but we don't get help at any great scale for 24 to 48 hours after a fire. So that first 24 hours, it's your neighbors that are going to help you.
Well, first of all, let's give a round of applause to our panelists.